Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time. I'm Aaron Helman, your host, and this is the most difficult podcast episode I've ever recorded. This is an episode about the Potawatomi Trail of Death, and that's not my name for it. That's just what it is. It's probably the most shameful moment in South Bend's long history. It's also impossible to tell the story of early South Bend without it. The fact is that South Bend continued to develop the way it did because the rest of the Native Americans were removed in the late 1830s and early 1840s. It probably would have continued to develop if that removal hadn't happened, but it would have certainly developed differently. The history would be different without it. The forcible removal of the Potawatomi Indians was a truly pivotal moment in the story of early South Bend. It's one of the most pivotal moments, right there with the arrival of the first traders, the exploitation of the portage, and the birth of the Michigan Road. This was one of the moments that built South Bend, one of the moments that changed and evolved and formed the city that we still know today. Not every formative moment is a good one. South Bend's earliest historians, Charles Chapman and Timothy Howard, were pretty light in the way they dealt with the role that South Bend's earliest hero, Alexis Coquillard, played in the Indian removals. They would tell you that Coquillard acted nobly and patriotically in an impossible situation. They would tell you that the removal was sad but inevitable. They would tell you that Coquillard was honorable, kind, merciful, and morally conflicted every step of the way. I have my doubts. Today's episode is going to be a little different, and my only goal is that by the time it's over, I will have been completely honest with you. You deserve that much. The history deserves that much. The people who died on that removal trail deserve that and more. I tell a lot of fun stories. This isn't one of them. I tell a lot of stories that give people reasons to be proud. This isn't one of those stories either. Here's the thing. It's not always history's job to entertain us. It's not always history's job to make us feel good. It's not even always history's job to judge the characters in the middle of its ugliest or most beautiful moments. Sometimes, it's just history's job to tell us what happened. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we're exploring the earliest years of South Bend, long before it was incorporated as a city, long before the Civil War, back in the earliest years, when it was just a few pioneers scratching out a living. During the course of this episode, you will not hear fictional advertisements for real historical companies and products. Our subject matter is too serious to break it up with moments of silly levity. We are thankful to our donors and sponsors for making this podcast possible. And now, with all that out of the way, let's do our best to understand how people just like you and me, could ever create something so horrible that history would remember it as a trail of death. You'll remember from episode 2 that before William Henry Harrison became America's shortest tenured president, he was the governor of the Indiana Territory, and his job was to get Native Americans to sign over their land. He was good at it. Between 1803 and 1809, Harrison negotiated more than a dozen treaties with tribes across Indiana. The methods he used were not always honorable. He played tribes against each other. He bought land from chiefs who didn't represent the people whose land was being sold. He poured more alcohol than a Notre Dame tailgate for the men on the other side of those negotiations, then waited for them to get good and drunk before it came time to sign anything. Tecumseh called the treaties illegitimate immediately. He was right. They became part of the reason for the War of 1812. But if you remember episode 2, you'll also remember this. Those Harrison treaties were negotiated in the Indiana Territory. The northern 10 miles of Indiana, including what would become South Bend, weren't part of the Indiana Territory at all at that time. It was part of the Michigan Territory. The Potawatomi who lived here were not party to Harrison's treaties. They hadn't signed anything, as far as they were concerned, and frankly, as far as the law was concerned too, their land was still their own. This is the world that Alexis Coquillard arrived at in 1823, and when he got here, the Potawatomi Indians were not a problem to be solved or a people to be scooted away. They were his most important business partners. No one had any notion to remove the Native American population from South Bend so long as they were delivering profits for the fur traders. And then, the fur trade died. It was after that when the state rediscovered a political will to remove the Native Americans. No one else had any financial reason to say otherwise, and so they didn't. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the federal government the power to negotiate the treaties that would move Native Americans to the other side of the Mississippi River. Between 1832 and 1837, federal agents negotiated a series of treaties with Potawatomi bands across northern Indiana. The terms were always roughly the same: sign here, take this money, and agree to leave within 2 years. Some bands signed. Some moved peacefully. The money that was paid out was, in many cases, immediately surrounded by white traders who sold the signatories whiskey and trinkets at exorbitant prices until the money was gone. The treaties that resulted became known, not unfairly, as the Whiskey Treaties. Most of the Potawatomi bands in Indiana complied. By the summer of 1838, most had already made the journey west, but not all of them. There's a fellow you should know about, a man who history should remember an awful lot more than it does. His name was Menominee. He was a Potawatomi chief. There's a street named after him in Chicago, and he deserves it. Menominee's village sat on the north bank of Twin Lakes, about 30 miles from South Bend. He was a Catholic convert, a preacher, a man who had spent years teaching his followers to abstain from alcohol, to live honestly, and to make peace with their white neighbors. When other tribes signed treaties, not everyone would want to leave, so they'd abandon their tribes to join Menominee's instead. The chief's village numbered 4 wigwams in 1821. There were more than 100 in 1838, when federal pressure was growing its heaviest. Menominee had not signed the 1836 Yellow River Treaty that was supposed to extinguish his band's claim to Twin Lakes. He said the other chiefs had been made drunk before they signed. He said his own signature had been forged. He sent petitions to President Van Buren and Secretary of War Lewis Cass, protesting that the treaty was a fraud. There is no record that anyone replied. In the spring of 1838, Menominee traveled to Washington with a delegation of Potawatomi leaders to make their case in person. The president refused to see them. They came home, having accomplished nothing. The deadline for removal was August 5, 1838. Menominee and his band did not move. White squatters had already begun arriving on the reservation, hoping to claim the best land before it went to public auction. Conflicts broke out. The squatters burned a dozen Indian cabins. The Potawatomi retaliated. The settlers petitioned the governor for protection. What they did not mention in their petition was that they were the ones who had arrived on land that still legally belonged to someone else. They didn't mention that they were the ones who'd opened with arson. Governor David Wallace ordered General John Tipton to muster 100 volunteers and proceed to Twin Lakes. Tipton was also a United States Senator. He was to solve the Potawatomi problem during the legislature's summer recess. The state named a county after him for his service. Federal agents went to Menominee. They warned him that Tipton and his forces were on their way. Menominee stood up. He made a speech. It went like this. Members of the council, the president does not know the truth. He, like me, has been imposed upon. He does not know that you have made my young chiefs drunk and got their consent and pretended to get mine. He does not know that I have refused to sell my lands and still refuse. He would not by force drive me from my home, the graves of my tribe and my children who have gone to the Great Spirit, nor allow you to tell me your braves will take me tied like a dog if he knew the truth. My brothers, the president is just, but he listens to the word of young chiefs who have lied, and when he knows the truth, he will leave me to my own. I have not sold my lands. I will not sell them. I have not signed any treaty and will not sign any. I am not going to leave my lands, and I don't want to hear anything more about it. Menominee kept his word. He did not sign any treaty. He did not sell any lands. It wasn't going to matter. On the morning of September 4th, 1838, General and Senator John Tipton gave the order to move. His forces had already surrounded Menominee's village. They'd gathered the Potawatomi from outlying camps and rounded up stragglers from as far as 30 miles away. Some sources suggest that Alexis Coquillard helped locate those stragglers, or that he served as a translator for the whole operation. He certainly wasn't ignorant of it. Tipton registered 859 names. He told his men to burn the crops so none would be tempted to come back. He told them to tear down the wigwams until Menominee's village looked like it had been swept by a hurricane. He told them to shackle Menominee and put him in the back of a wagon. Menominee might have gotten it easy. The rest of his people were going to have to march. The caravan that left Twin Lakes on September 4th included 859 Potawatomi men, women, and children. It included 286 horses and 26 wagons. It included an armed escort of 100 soldiers. It did not include enough food, or enough wagons, or enough medicine. It was the middle of a drought. The summer of 1838 was one of the hottest and driest in memory, and the roads across Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri were thick with dust that rose in clouds around the marchers and settled into their lungs. We might not know how truly awful it was if not for a young French Catholic priest named Father Benjamin Marie Petit. He had been the missionary to Menominee's band at Twin Lakes, baptizing their children and saying Mass in their log chapel. He was 27 years old. He was in South Bend when the march began, but he rushed to join his flock as soon as he received word. He caught up with them near Danville, Illinois, and he wrote letters home that described what he found. He described his parishioners moving under a burning noonday sun, enveloped in clouds of dust, surrounded by soldiers hurrying their steps. He described sick human beings crowded into wagons under canvas awnings that blocked the air without blocking the heat, turning the wagon beds into ovens. He described children overcome by the heat, reduced to what he called a wretched state of languor and exhaustion. 6 miles outside of Danville, the caravan halted for 2 days. They dug 6 graves during those 2 days, and they filled them. Days rarely passed without someone dying, usually a child. The families would bury their dead quickly and keep walking because the soldiers wouldn't wait. They crossed Indiana, they crossed Illinois, they crossed the Mississippi River at Quincy. They moved through Missouri. The water they found along the way was often stagnant and drawn from streams that were drying in the drought. Typhoid moved through the caravan like a fire. There was nothing the physician could do. The Potawatomi trusted Father Pettit more than the doctor anyway, and so the young priest moved among the sick and the dying, baptizing the children he feared would not survive the night, and blessing the graves of those who didn't. At least 42 people died on the march. At least 28 of them were children. On November 4th, 1838, 61 days and 660 miles after they left Twin Lakes, the survivors arrived at their destination on the Osage River in what is now eastern Kansas. There were 756 of them left. 103 people had died or escaped along the way. When they arrived, there was nothing waiting for them. The government had promised houses. There were no houses. There was no shelter of any kind. Winter was coming. They had walked 660 miles, buried their children in unmarked graves along the roadside, and arrived at a patch of Kansas prairie with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they had managed to carry. There is no record of the number of people who died in the months after they arrived. Father Pettit stayed with them for a few weeks until he arranged for them to move to a Catholic mission called Sugar Creek, about 20 miles south. Then he turned around and started the long journey back toward Indiana. He died on the way. Father Pettit didn't make it home either. The Trail of Death removed the largest concentration of Potawatomi from northern Indiana, but there were still stragglers. Some were hiding out. Some were affiliated with bands that had managed to avoid contracts and military escorts. The government didn't much care why they were still there. The government just wanted them gone, and they needed someone to make that happen. Someone who could find the Native Americans. Someone the Native Americans would trust enough to follow. Someone who spoke their language. And then there was Alexis Coquillard. He'd spent the previous 2 years watching his dream collapse. The Kankakee mill race was nothing but a very expensive ditch that couldn't carry water. Coquillard had lost nearly everything. The foreclosure on his land holdings had already begun. The man who had founded South Bend was, at least for the moment, ruined. And then the government showed up with a job that needed done, and they offered him $40,000 to do it. The year was 1840, and Alexis Coquillard signed a contract to complete the job that Tipton had started. Timothy Howard tells us that Coquillard performed the 1840 removal humanely, which is hard to swallow, but at least it appears that people didn't die during Coquillard's removals the way they did during the Trail of Death. According to Howard, Coquillard arranged for his removals to be done in wagons so the people wouldn't suffer the march. According to Howard, the Indians went willingly with Coquillard, a man they considered their beloved Potawatomi chief. According to Howard, there is a good and right way to forcibly remove people from their homes. As for the people of South Bend, it seems they were content to look the other way. The removal of the last of the Native Americans was met with a single paragraph in the June 5, 1840 issue of the St. Joseph Valley Register. Our town is full of Potawatomi Indians. They are here for the purpose of holding a talk with General Brady of the U.S. Army upon the subject of their removal west of the Mississippi. They hold a council today. We have understood that they have expressed a willingness to emigrate. A week later, the paper reports that Coquillard has accepted the contract to make sure the Indians get removed. The paper does not report when the removal begins. They do not report when Coquillard returns after the removal is over. The papers do not mention the episode ever again until it comes as a passing mention in Alexis Coquillard's obituary 15 years later. And when that obituary lands, it comes with a hell of a footnote. It seems like Coquillard never got his money. According to the obituary, the $40,000 in government drafts passed through the hands of a partner, a fur trader named Lewis M. Alverson. Whatever Alverson did with the money, it doesn't look like he ever shared it with Coquillard. It also doesn't look like Coquillard ever tried to recover it. Do with that what you will. The original people were gone by the end of 1840, just 20 years after Pierre Navarre arrived at the southernmost bend on the St. Joseph River. He married one of those original people. Some stories tell that when those people were rounded up and marched away, Pierre Navarre went with them. The South Bend that he left in his wake was a place he didn't know anymore, a place that would have been almost impossible to recognize compared against a few decades earlier. In 1821, Navarre was the only settler here, not counting the Native Americans, and the census takers never counted the Native Americans. The place that would become South Bend had an 1821 population of 1. 10 years later, when Coquillard and Taylor platted, there were 128. 10 years after that, there were more than 700. This was South Bend, a place straddling a portage that used to be very important, situated on a road that was becoming more important every day and cleaved down the middle by a dry ditch that no one could afford to fill in. The people who drove their earliest economy, and not all that long ago, were gone. It was up to the settlers to determine what was going to come next. There was no one else left. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. In our next episode, we're wrapping up our series on the first 20 years of the city by looking at some of the famous firsts in the early history of South Bend. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.